My name is Kelly Olson. I'm the policy manager with the Civil Survival Project, and I am formerly incarcerated, and I'd like to pass it off to Malika.
Hi, my name is Malika Lamont, and I'm the director of Vocal Washington, which stands for Voices of Community and Activist Leaders Washington. We work to organize people that have been impacted by mass incarceration, war on drugs, homelessness, HIV and AIDS, and other forms of systemic violence in order to build political power. And my family has been impacted by the drug war and other forms of systemic violence. Deontay?
Thanks, Malika. Hello, everyone. My name is Deontay Damper. My pronouns are he, him. I am the chair of Black Lives Matter Seattle King County, where we know we are more than just a hashtag. For the past 3 years, we have been protecting, educating, and building community through policy and radical change. Very happy to be a part of this event with Vocal and other fellow panelists. And I'm also a proud person that is in recovery. So, Davis.
Hi everyone, my name is Lauren. I represent the 32nd Legislative District, which straddles the North King County, South Snohomish County line. I identify as a person in recovery from mental health challenges and someone who has many family members, loved ones. My life has been incredibly impacted by loved ones with substance use disorder, including entanglement with the criminal legal system. Really glad to be here. Love Civil Survival, big fan. And look forward to the screening.
Great, thank you. And for those of you who are not familiar with Civil Survival Project is an organization led by and for people who are formerly incarcerated. We go by the kind of educate, motivate, and liberate. And so we believe that those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And we work to create systemic change and change the laws that hold us back. So we're excited to present this documentary tonight. This is a 35-minute documentary about the history of misdemeanors and kind of how problematic they are. And after the screening, I'll be posting somewhere I'll post a link, but there's a survey if you fill it out after the documentary where you can get a free book. So let me go ahead and start the documentary. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Oops, actually, hold on. I forgot to do the sound settings, which would not be good. Try this again.
Gotta love these Zooms.
Yeah.
I mean, Kelly could just ad-lib the whole thing.
Right.
Options.
Biggest misconception about misdemeanors is that they are minor.
To start hearing more and more stories of voter suppression, that broke my heart.
They're the ones that are using the system.
My grandma was fighting for integration back in her day, and I'm fighting for the same thing now.
The problem is the system is working the way it's supposed to.
We're recording.
All right.
Sometimes I feel like my life ended that day.
My car died on the side of the road. A cop walked over to my car and asked me if I needed help, and I said no.
John Clark was convicted on a misdemeanor gambling charge and was forced to work on a chain gang.
I just remember being pushed, like being cornered into a wall.
I was just starting out life.
And I didn't think I had anything to hide.
Mary Gay was sentenced to 30 days. plus court costs for stealing a hat.
I was arrested that evening.
It was a misdemeanor. That was the beginning of the nightmare that I had to go through.
Henry Nelson was arrested for using abusive language in the presence of a female and was sent off to the coal mines.
He said, "You're going to jail." And I'm like, "What for?"
Misdemeanors have historically been the chump change crimes that we didn't pay attention to.
I've done nothing. Man, I just got beat up by the police last night. I could have lost my life.
13 million. That's about 80% of all American criminal dockets. 80% of what our criminal courts do is misdemeanors.
Got him in cuffs, look. I ain't doing nothing. The story of misdemeanors is the story of law enforcement continuing to prioritize African Americans, Mexican immigrants, America's so-called criminal class.
Hey, you act like I really just committed a serious crime.
You did do something illegal. You crossed the crosswalk.
You might see 2 or 3 police standing here waiting for you.
And cops will jump out of the van anytime, anywhere.
That's what I was doing. The misdemeanor system has not gotten its fair share of blame. Misdemeanors are the invidious first step in the racialization of crime in this country.
Too often, arrests for minor crimes devolve into police violence and death for Black and brown people.
They got me for jaywalking.
Not wearing a seatbelt.
My tail light was out.
I was arrested for being home. Driving with a suspended license. My license got suspended because I didn't know I had an unsafe parking.
I was drunk, and that was arrested. They claimed that I was in
I was $741 fine because I didn't pay.
How far back that goes is a really dark story. Reconstruction was an era when 4 million African Americans made it out of bondage and were able to achieve at really high levels, whether it was in business, in education, different ways of prosperity that really threatened white supremacy.
They elected many Black men to positions of power. Of course, that was a sea change from how power had been exercised during slavery, and a lot of white folks just didn't like it. They were nostalgic for the old days of overt white supremacy, and so they subverted Reconstruction.
If you look at misdemeanors and you track them from the Reconstruction era to modern day, you see the fingerprints everywhere of white supremacy and control of Black bodies.
The landowners, they had nearly lost everything. And the only way to get that back is to somehow corral the Black labor force back onto the same plantations that they had once worked.
The most effective way of forcing African Americans back into this condition that would be so similar to slavery was to begin to criminalize Black life itself.
Misdemeanor offenses for incredibly trivial or made-up things, what should have been tiny penalties for non-existent offenses, turn into years of people's lives.
Where were you taken? I was taken out to the camps. Where did you sleep? Slept on some hay. Chain was on me.
I'm being put into handcuffs. I'm being dragged into this cold space. I don't have anything to cover myself. And I'm asked to sit inside of this tiny little room, and I have no idea why I'm there.
Was there any jury that tried you? No, sir. Did the recorder ask you whether you wanted a lawyer? No, sir.
And I thought that I would have time to talk to a court-appointed attorney so we could talk about what happened. I could ask them to get other, pieces of evidence that would prove that, hey, I'm poor. It wasn't like I was trying to run off with this money.
Did they furnish any copy of the charge against you? No, sir, they did not. Did they give you any opportunity to plead to any accusation? They never gave me anything at all.
When they asked me how I pled no contest. I didn't understand that no contest is the same as guilty, and that I would walk away with a misdemeanor that would affect my ability to get hired.
The justice system after emancipation was weaponized against Black people. It perpetuated slavery by making the mechanisms of enslavement pretty much the same. Family separation, backbreaking labor, people having no rights. You could be sold on the steps of the courthouse that you were convicted in and given to the highest bidder.
A whole separate criminal code that applied to African Americans was established.
Many misdemeanor offenses are best understood as mechanisms of social control. They're not designed to catch dangerous or guilty people, but rather they are tools. We give them to police as additional ways of exercising their authority.
Some of these laws were overtly race-based, and with others then and now, the understanding was that the laws would look race-neutral, but they would be applied and enforced almost exclusively against Black people.
For these governments to sell prisoners into slavery, you first have to arrest lots of people. There's a big problem with that, though. There's just not enough crime for this system to work and for it to be profitable. The state governments of the South had to invent new crimes.
Southern legislatures, which are essentially run by Confederates at that time, are trying to reinscribe a form of slavery through a system of laws called Black Codes.
A whole category of new statutes passed in almost every southern state that attached these enormous penalties to what were in reality very minor thefts. Those were laws, and many others like it, that were only ever enforced against African Americans. And so it became a way to have a basis for arresting huge numbers of Black people.
I don't remember much about writing the check.
John Owen was caught taking 6 ears of corn from a cornfield and was arrested under the Black Codes.
This is $4, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 times 4 is $28. So just this pile right here is how much I went to jail for.
Owen was put in jail for months until he was finally tried for theft.
I have a theft charge. It's theft by check. I had money in the bank, but I didn't know how long it took for checks to process. Like, I know better now. I could have donated plasma, gotten $25.
Under his sentence, Owen was leased into convict labor and sent to the chain gang, where he served 2 years for the corn and a 3rd year for the court costs.
I was in the Hays County Jail for a total of 45 days for $25 worth of food.
Michael Brown, who was the teenager who was killed by police in Ferguson, whose death led to the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement, he was stopped for jaywalking. He stepped off the sidewalk and was walking in the street, and there was a local criminal ordinance that made it a crime to do so. African Americans are being cited for jaywalking at 3, 5, 10 times the rate of white pedestrians.
The legislatures of the white South make it a crime to walk alongside a railroad. In an era in which there are no paved roads, the easiest way for a poor person to get from one place to another is to walk alongside a railroad. That law didn't say this only applies to Black people, but those were laws that were only ever enforced against African Americans.
All of us engage in what would be considered to be minor crimes. And for some people, it's crossing the street at the wrong time. But if you're Black or brown, then it becomes categorized as something that's criminal.
So what is I doing? Didn't use your crosswalk. All I'm trying to do is go home, man. I'm tired. I just got off of work.
Nandi Kane says he was walking home from work when it happened.
Because I felt like they were gonna draw a gun out and shoot me in my back.
I'm tired of all this shit, man.
Vagrancy laws were passed that essentially meant any black person who was found on the streets unemployed and couldn't show evidence of work was a criminal, a vagrant.
Trespass laws originate from this idea that African Americans only belong in certain spaces and at certain times. And so they give police officers the ability, under the guise of law, to dictate where an African American person can be, what time they can be there, and how they can operate in certain spaces.
My kids' daycare was inside of one of the buildings to the Skyway, so I figured I'd take a walk, find somewhere to sit down, and wait on them to get there.
I'm going to New Horizons to pick up my kids. I was sitting there for 10 minutes.
Monroe Dolphus was standing in the train yard when he was grabbed by the sheriff's deputy. Monroe stated that he had not committed any crime.
You're gonna go to jail. I'm not doing anything wrong. Hold on. Can you please? I'm not, no, come on, brother. I'm not your brother. This is assault.
At this moment, I saw my children's daycare class and their teachers and everything walking past while this was happening. He took the taser and drove it into my leg, and pretty much at that point lost all control of the leg.
The deputy later claimed that the crime committed by Dolphus was taking a 25-cent tin of fish from the lunch pail of a Southern Railway worker. Unable to provide any evidence to support this, the charge was changed to vagrancy.
And I kept asking them what I was being charged with. They'll create false charges just to make sure that everything is perpetuated.
Judge Longshore found Dolphus guilty of misdemeanor vagrancy and sentenced him to 5 months and 20 days of hard labor in the mines of Tennessee, coal, iron, and railroad.
Going back to the vagrancy laws of the late 19th century, the people who make those laws have in mind another group of people for whom there is an inherent threat to their livelihood, like breaking barbecue ordinances in public parks or sleeping in dormitories that white people don't think you live there.
I have every right to call the police.
It allows law enforcement to regulate whether or not certain behavior for one group of people is deemed criminal and another group of people is just frivolous activity.
Many people remember the Starbucks debacle in Philadelphia. There were 2 African-American men at a Starbucks. The employee had them arrested for loitering where they're clearly not engaging in that behavior.
What did they get called for? Because there are 2 black guys sitting here meeting me? Yes, I didn't know.
Loitering is a police tool of choice. It's the go-to offense that police often use to impose their authority. In the misdemeanor system, there is no conduct too minor, no act too small that the state cannot render a crime.
Black people charged with a misdemeanor are 75% more likely to be locked up than white people. You have to realize that these laws didn't happen by chance. They were part of a system to continue to oppress black bodies.
Our misdemeanor system includes all kinds of offenses, and some of them can be quite serious. Domestic violence, DUI, but most of the time, we treat minor, harmless conduct as misdemeanors. Traffic offenses, jaywalking, order maintenance offenses, spitting, driving on a suspended license for failure to pay a fine. And yet, these minor, meaningless misdemeanors can have terrible consequences for individuals. To understand the misdemeanor system, follow the money.
The accused are paying for the judges, the prosecutors, and the public defender.
More than $3.5 million off phone commissary at the jail. It's a known moneymaker.
They call it the $20
I'm a family member transfers money in jail.
Pocketing leftover money from the inmates'
about
food
$2,000 a month in
They are a controversial food vendor with a big state contract.
Waste and abuse.
Aramark is
the company that uses inmate workers.
Today's system is estimated at $80 billion. The misdemeanor side of it is a way of saddling people with fines and fees that will put money in the pockets of the administrators of that system.
The first time I got a ticket, my insurance had lapsed.
So I got the speeding ticket and I got a no insurance ticket at the same time. The next time I got pulled over, I was arrested for driving with a suspended license. I paid the tickets, paid the court costs, paid my fees and fines, but they said for driving with a suspended license, the punishment for that is we're gonna suspend your license for 2 years. I would often have to choose between paying my inspection or my registration or paying my light bill or other bills that I had. I had to drive my car to get to work because I had a construction job. If I needed to take material to the job, I couldn't take plywood or 2x4s on a bus.
I felt like there was no way I was gonna be able to take care of the kids on my own while you were out because I didn't know how long you were gonna be in jail.
This officer saw me, a young Hispanic guy, driving a 63 Impala and said, you know what, that guy, he's up to something. I was trying to go to work, trying to pay bills, and he's treating me like a hardened criminal. That misdemeanor charge ended up becoming something that I couldn't get rid of.
They're being treated as revenue sources, charged daily fees for being in jail, supervision fees, tether fees, drug testing fees, database fees to fund bail bondsmen, private probation companies, electronic monitoring companies, drug testing companies. It is disturbingly similar to the way that we saw African Americans being exploited in the post-war South.
I'm Demario Davis, linebacker for the New Orleans Saints. I was born and raised in Mississippi, pretty much raised by a single mom. Entering into my second year of college, me and a teammate were caught shoplifting groceries from Walmart. It kind of felt a lot more like a drug bust than us having stole some groceries. The bail was set at $10,000, and I didn't have $10,000. The football coaches bailed us out. A misdemeanor, you're supposed to be able to be in front of the judge within 90 days, but this is not happening. This is not happening in our country. We have people who are spending 7-8 months in jail who have not even been sentenced.
Cop arrested me and I was charged with the misdemeanor.
The term chain gang was coined on account of the shackle worn by convict laborers.
They said, okay, listen, we're gonna let you go home now. But Scram's gonna come and put a monitor on you.
They were taken to an anvil where a rivet was pounded into the ankle cuffs to keep them closed. Then the cuffs were chained together.
The initial fee to get on the Scram was $250. That's just to have it put on. Then after that, they charged me $220 a month for the actual monitor.
Many of the convicts suffered from shackle sores, ulcers where the iron ground against their skin. Gangrene and other infections were also common.
Right after they put it on me, they start causing these really severe sores and rashes. And their attitude pretty much is, it's court ordered, it's by a judge, and you'll wear it, or you can go back to jail.
The emaciated convict laborers worked their entire days barefoot, but the shackles were always on their ankles. They mined in them, slept in them, and those who died of disease or beatings were buried in them.
What they're doing is unjust. What they're doing is profiteering, because you're paying them. You're their slave with their shackle on your foot.
I remember this hopeless feeling just overcome me. I couldn't take care of my family.
The biggest misconception about misdemeanors is that they are minor. The full consequences of getting a misdemeanor can be astronomical.
It hurt me for 10 years, and it completely disrupted my life. And I've been trying to figure out how to get my life back on track. This will be a part of my story for the rest of my life.
When people are booked into jails for a week or a year or even a day, you just cannot avoid the trauma that inflicts upon you. The moment you hit the jail, you don't come out of that unchanged or untouched. You witness trauma, you witness violence, and it changes you. It changes your community.
I tried to get a job at Amazon where my roommate worked. I called to Walmart and I called to several other retail stores. I got turned away because I had a misdemeanor charge for theft.
Not enough people talk about what it means to have a misdemeanor on your record. It can determine the kind of job that you get, to the kind of housing that you can qualify for, to the kind of schools that you can go to. A lot of people are harmed for life because of the smallest infractions.
They're being rendered homeless. They're going without food, without medication. Their children are suffering.
Due to misdemeanors, I lost my housing. Shortly after that, I lost my vehicle, which led to me losing my job. And it was just one thing after another, like kicks to the face. I had full custody of my children. They had to get to school. We had to sleep in the car, waking up at like 4 in the morning, getting to a laundromat to make sure that they have clean school uniforms.
I had worked so hard, and all of that was ruined by one charge. One misdemeanor ruined my ability to get even just basic work.
They can't get a job if they have to check a box that says they've been convicted of a crime. They can't even rent housing because they got poor credit when they received a ridiculous $500 speeding violation. So this system was designed both to extract from people, but also to marginalize their presence in society.
It's gonna be a mass grave site.
This is the dormitory. The stupid crowd, these are the beds. They right beside each other, and this is the space.
Everybody just dying and getting sick and shit. Like, this shit serious as fuck. Bro, you all right? You want me to go get the police?
No.
What have you done this bitch?
You ain't gonna do nothing about it.
This motherfucker literally in this bitch dying, bro. I don't know what to do.
One of the worst places to be during this pandemic is locked up in jail.
The judge never said, I'm sending you to prison to die.
The same horror story is emerging of the unchecked spread of infection and inmates essentially being left to die.
Now, jaywalking or theft of a small amount or any sort of vagrancy type of behavior can lead to your incarceration and eventual contracting of the virus and death.
I've been in jail for 2.5 months for petty theft, a nonviolent crime that carries a misdemeanor charge for the price value of less than $100. There's been 3 deaths, 2 being inmates, 1 being a guard. As far as like people who are working for the facility, they're like intertwined. They could easily be catching it. That's how one of the guards caught it. My life is in danger.
These human beings aren't valued enough for us to apply the same kinds of safety measures there that we are in other sectors of society. If it wasn't already bad enough that you are booked into jail because you didn't have the money to pay the ticket and your license is suspended, that is now life-threatening to you.
Sheriff's Office is now releasing non-violent inmates as a next step in mitigating the spread of COVID-19.
Hundreds of inmates have been released from Shelby County's jail in an effort to put fewer people at risk for coronavirus. 600 inmates.
A total of 38 inmates are ordered released.
They were inmates. Now they're freed people.
Because of COVID-19, thousands of misdemeanor defendants are rightly being released. It's clear that these individuals should have never been incarcerated in the first place. We can tell by the fact that after these releases, we haven't seen any sort of crime wave. There's a different type of crime wave that should concern us, though, and that's the crime of violence against Black people post-Civil War.
State violence has historically been used to intimidate people of color, especially Black people. We see this all throughout history.
Misdemeanors, they have almost nothing to do with public safety. What misdemeanors do is give police an extraordinary amount of discretion with any minor offense premised on the idea that the Black man is a threat.
Misdemeanors are a very specific mechanism that legalize violence toward Black people and keep them in a very particular place, not just as individuals, but as an entire community of people.
When we look at so many cases in history, often what started as an investigation or a claim of a petty misdemeanor offense led to police officer-supported and sanctioned racial terrorism.
All too often, we see police exercising that terrible authority of violence against people who have only been suspected of the most minor of crimes.
The problem isn't bad apple cops. The problem is the system is working the way it's supposed to.
Police shot this boy outside my apartment. They killed him.
Hey, bro! You move, I swear to God! Hey, boss!
I just did pretty. It's awful. I'm so sorry. I have no gun.
Gray appeared to be unable to walk and was screaming as he was carried, feet dragging on the ground, to a police van.
I know, you just doing your job.
Mama, they gonna kill me, man. I can't breathe. Please, give me my dick. I can't breathe on me. Please.
My life could have so easily been taken in that skyway. George Floyd goes to show further that the most minor of offenses, even no offense at all, could result in death.
The very purpose of racial terrorism is control, is social control.
What we have seen in the killings of those accused was that misdemeanors became the gateway for police violence and murder.
We are seeing decriminalization. We are seeing citations instead of arrests. We are seeing people let out of jail. We are seeing pushback against fines and fees. But at the same time, there is so much more work that needs to be done.
Who defined what a misdemeanor is? The whole thing was built on exploitation, on racial violence, on building up industrial capitalism.
We should not be locking up people who speed, who are too poor to pay a fine or a fee, who loiter or trespass or jaywalk. They're not dangerous, they're not scary.
There's never been a good reason to lock up anybody for petty offenses. Like slavery back in the day, the law itself is doing the work of oppression. The criminal law is providing the authority to arrest Black people, to punish Black people, to kill Black people. And ultimately, the real crime is that we're Black.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Definitely a heavy film. I've seen it 3 times now. I think that what we'd like to do, one of our panelists here, Deontay, needs to get off early. So let's go ahead. Deontay, do you want to do introduce yourself and give kind of a reaction? I know it's a tough film to watch.
That was really tough. And y'all in the chat, if you're in the chat, write your reactions in the space too. Deontay Damper, Chair of Black Lives Matter, Seattle, King County. And when I watched the 13th probably for the first time a couple of weeks ago, but this one was a little bit more detailed in the spaces of the history. The way that they showed the past history and the present history, things have not changed in our systems. When we are talking about, and I too have been incarcerated myself, and really they were all for petty thefts. I went to prison for 3 petty thefts in that space. But when it comes down to it, it's systematically, this system has been set up for Black and brown people to fail. You're one, right? And the thing that I noticed is that the privileged America, I'll just say that, knows these things. And it's simply just setting us up setting us up to fail. And that is part of the reason why one of the things where I kind of got emotional was when they started talking about the COVID outbreak in the prisons. And I am formerly, I was a peer mentor for Department of Corrections. And that is part of the reason why I had to get out of there. Because watching the impacts of some of the people that were going in, and they're just looked at just a number, and then DLC wanting to hide the fact that people are dying in that space. Not the fact that they have family or friends or people waiting for them to get out. There was a guy that was in there, had 6 months to get out and passed away due to COVID. I'm not sure of the charges that he had in the space, but it also comes down to accountability for what that looks like. If we're talking about public health crises that happen, we really have to look inside of the prisons and how that has impacted us too. Sorry, I'm a little tongue-tied in the spaces of my words, but the video in itself is a call to action. I just seen recently someone out here in Seattle was running for office, and they were saying, I'm charging for very many. I'm not doing this misdemeanor thing with this community here. And I think that that's something that we need to pay attention to. I'm not in the space to endorse, so that's why I'm not saying the name. But it is something, it is a conversation us as community members need to have. Washington has done a great job in this space of stating, no, you jail. But what does that look like for some of our young adults? They're already talking about closing down the King County jail. So what does that mean? They're going to probably stack some of our 16-year-olds in the SCORE prison, in SCORE jail, which I'm calling now SCORE prison, because all in all, it was built for a reason, siloed out away from community, from community spaces, and it's just, we just really just have to pay attention to the fact of these systems are just set up for us to fail. I'm very happy to be in the space with you three to have the discussion about what that looks like. Yes, sorry.
Thank you, Deontay. Okay, we were thinking next, maybe Malika, you could talk about the Blake decision, kind of how things were before that. And then Rep. Davis, we're hoping that after Malika talks a little bit about what the Blake decision was, that you'll kind of share how the legislature responded and what became out of that. So pass it over to Malika.
Thank you both everyone for their responses. That movie was really gut-wrenching and made me think of my friends, my family, people that I love, and how misdemeanors and citations, and myself, things that I've encountered that could have ended that way. The Blake decision was a decision that was handed down by Washington State's Supreme Court in recognition that our simple possession of drugs law was actually one of the most egregious in the country, because you could be held, Washington has a history of doing this. We had the most egregious police use of force law, and we also had one of the most egregious simple possession laws in the country. You could be held responsible for possession even if the drugs weren't yours. So if somebody was in your car and something fell out your pocket, their pocket, and you got pulled over, you could get charged with a drug possession charge for having that in your car. Directly in the Blake decision, the woman that her case that went to the Supreme Court, she had a baggie in the back pocket of a pair of jeans that she was wearing that belonged to her friend. And she didn't know that it was back there. She just put the jeans on, and it was a baggie that had contained drugs. And she was charged with simple possession. And she had the ability to be able to challenge that. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And there was a lot of pontificating from the legislature and also from the Supreme Court about how this was undoing the racist history of our drug possession laws here in the United States. And I think that it made it so that they found it unconstitutional, but then we saw this whole movement from other people within the legislature that were like, oh, well, we should just put knowingly in the clause and go right back to having, a simple possession law that is racist and all the things that everybody had just said we were undoing, and that we were undoing the legacy of the drug war. And then other people were like, oh, well, we should have a misdemeanor because there has to be quote unquote accountability. And, it was a very revealing time this past legislative season to see how people wanted to respond to the Blake decision. And we ended up landing, I'm not to go too much into Representative Davis's portion, but, we're now at a place where it is no longer a felony, but it is a misdemeanor. And we already know that that is going to disproportionately impact people of color and poor people in Washington State, and that misdemeanors inevitably become criminal matters, like even further criminalized because people aren't able to, meet the requirements of their misdemeanor charge. So we went from de facto decriminalization of simple possession, so small amounts. There was a lot of rhetoric and disinformation that was getting sown, saying that it meant that any amount of drugs was legal for people to have, when in actuality that's not what happened. And I think that people were really confused about what that decision meant, but it just meant that simple possession the law was unconstitutional, and therefore it was decriminalized. We still unfortunately have plenty of very antiquated and harmful drug laws on the books. And now we have another one that includes a misdemeanor. Now, it does include also building out of the systems of care, but I'll let Lauren Davis speak to that.
Great. Thank you, Deontay and Malika. And thanks again, Kelly, for having us. I know I'm supposed to jump into Blake, but I just want to say thank you for that film. It was incredibly impactful. You know, I sit on the House Public Safety Committee, and we have jurisdiction over every one of those things that was discussed, over electronic home monitoring, over actually it's the Judiciary Committee over the kind of the fines and fees, the legal financial obligations, but the conditions in jails and all of that. And of all the things that struck me most in that film, there was a part where they're comparing it to the Black Codes, and the woman's voice says, family separation, backbreaking labor, and no rights. And I just found that particular soundbite to be exactly what our jail and prison system is today. So thank you again for that. So what did the legislature do? So the session started on January 11th, and it ended on April 25th. It's our typical 105-day session. And about 6 weeks in, on the 25th of February, so if you introduce any other big idea that late into session, like forget about it. You know, most big bills, controversial bills, big financial investments take, you know, a couple years of kind of pre-work. Maybe you run it one session, then you work it over the interim. And we found out 6 weeks into session that the Supreme Court had thrown out our entire statute, as Malika described. And there were a group of us, you know, the more progressive members and those of us that work in the space of criminal legal reform, that spent about 72 hours jubilating, like, awesome, you know, the Supreme Court did it for us. They did the politically difficult thing that we probably wouldn't have the votes for. Cool, like, let's just build the behavioral health system. And then somebody said the word preemption. And I'm not an attorney, but essentially we learned that if the legislature, the state law was not sort of occupying that space in law, if the example I can give would be firearm laws. So the state has a firearm law, but like King County or the city of Seattle cannot make a firearm law that's, you know, more stringent, for instance, than the state law currently, because state law preempts. And the same is true with the drug possession. But if the Supreme Court vacated that entire statute, then the state was no longer occupying that policy space. And so what that meant was lower government, local government, so cities and counties, could essentially wage their own local war on drugs. And the sentencing range for the felony drug possession for somebody that didn't have previous offenses was about 3 months under the sentencing grid, even when it was a felony. But if a city or a county decided that they wanted to create their own highly racist war on drugs, they could, and they were. Several municipalities and counties were already working to pass, prior to the legislature taking action, a recriminalization that made it a gross misdemeanor, which is punishable by up to 364 days in jail. And the fines jump what you can require for a gross misdemeanor versus a simple misdemeanor. So in terms of so we eventually, after our couple days of jubilation, realized we probably did unfortunately have to do something, because we made a decision that it was going to be worse to have this patchwork of extremely punitive drug laws. And a lot of our city councils, even in more liberal areas, even in King County, the actual city councils are actually fairly conservative. And that's partially because city councils are nonpartisan, so people aren't voting for a D and an R, and you end up with conservative leaning municipal governments. And so the capacity for serious damage to our communities was significant if we failed to act. And so we ended up, the House and the Senate Democrat, the leadership appointed teams to kind of come up with a response. And I was on the House team for the Blake decision response. And some of the decision points that we considered, so one of the decision points was whether or not we wanted to include threshold amounts. The initiative that passed in Oregon did have threshold amounts. Our previous statute did not. So it was basically any amount, whether it was residue all the way up to any quantity. If there was no indicia of dealing, then that was going to be felony possession. But there's zero, to be clear, evidence base for why you should have threshold amounts. I mean, somebody no more has substance use disorder if they have 2 grams versus 9 grams. I mean, and it's very likely for personal use, but there's kind of political considerations. The public has a fear of drugs, and they have a fear of large quantities of drugs. And so there may be some kind of public messaging or political advantage to creating a threshold, however arbitrary, if you were to create a threshold that actually did in fact capture most people. And it is true that most people are arrested for residue, right? Or a point, right? Which is 1/10 of a gram. I mean, a very small amount of narcotics. And so that was one consideration, and we ultimately decided not to, for various reasons, have those, in part because they're so arbitrary. Another consideration was our hope was that we would be able to not create any sort of criminal penalty whatsoever, so a true decriminalization. And unfortunately, to pass any bill, you have to be able to count to 76. You have to have your 50 votes in the House, your 25 votes in the Senate, and 1 governor willing to sign. And unfortunately, we just didn't have it. We didn't have the votes in to be able to get it through. And so then we started looking at alternatives. And so we looked at, okay, what about a civil infraction? And that's what Oregon did. But again, as we saw, that would be something like jaywalking. But I mean, the statistic that they showed, 89% in New York City, 95% in Ferguson, Missouri, of these jaywalking tickets going to Black and brown people. I mean, that's what we would see if we created a civil infraction for possession, but it was still considered favorable compared to a misdemeanor or a felony. And so unfortunately, we did the vote counting on that one as well, and we didn't have the votes for that either. And so then the legislature is sort of the art of negotiating. So then the House went back to the Senate, which as a whole, the Senate is a more conservative body, just because there's just more moderate members there. And so we went back and said, fine, what about a simple misdemeanor, but you've got these 2 required pre-arrest diversions. So someone's not, that whole interaction that was described that is so inherently traumatic is not happening, that there is no arrest, that individuals are not being taken to jail or into custody at all. And so that's where we netted, is on these 2 required diversions in the field into services. And Malik and I and many others have been hard at work on what that looks like. There were, I guess, the bright part of the bill was not that. It's actually incredibly sad and damning, particularly in light of what we just saw, to have recriminalized the symptoms of a treatable brain disease. But we were at least able to include in the bill itself a little less than $100 million, and then elsewhere in the budget more, but really significant investments. By most of my career, I've worked in addiction recovery, and by my math, it's the single largest investment in the substance use disorder continuum of care ever in state history by a lot, by orders of magnitude. And there was money kind of put into the 2 parts of the substance use continuum of care that we historically neglected. Just quickly, there's kind of what we would call pre-treatment services, so outreach and engagement services to people who aren't yet connected to care and aren't in services. And then you have treatment, and then you have recovery support services, which is everything that helps people stay in recovery, housing, a sense of purpose, so education and employment pathways, childcare, transportation, all the social determinants. And historically, as a state, we have funded treatment and only treatment because most of it is billed to the federal government and insurance. But we have put next to nothing into those outreach services to help people get into care, and then the recovery support services to help people stay in recovery. And for the first time, I mean, we put tens of millions of dollars into both of those buckets. It's going to be still insufficient, but it is a real sea change in terms of what we've funded, what we've prioritized. And Malika's organization and Kylie's organization, Civil Referral being part of, is heavily involved in the implementation of what that's going to look like, and how do we get people into services for their behavioral health challenges before they ever come crashing into the criminal legal system. So I think, sorry for the mouthful there, Kelly. It was a pretty wild session.
No, it definitely was. Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to let people know to go ahead and put some questions in the Q&A, and we can get to those. And then, Malika, do you want to add some more thoughts after what Lauren had to share?
To the point of the investments that are, people are oftentimes so, they get upset or get insecure or shaken when we start talking about divesting from systems that we know don't work and reinvesting in systems that or building out systems of care that are actually evidence-based and that we know are more effective. And it is so frustrating to have those facts be skewed in order to fulfill this, these disinformation campaigns and this rhetoric that, we're somehow anti a certain group of people or we're anti an institution, when, what we're saying is, let's do what works. Let's do the practical thing. Let's do the thing that makes sense. And we saw a lot of that over the session as well. But that was one thing that was heartening, is that part of 5476 did prevail, that we are going to build out systems of care. We're going to do it in relevant ways with, key principles that are based in harm reduction, that meet people where they are, that help them progress along, the cycle of behavior change with support. And hopefully we'll be able to reduce the harm of interactions with systems that we know are harmful and that don't work. So yeah, it looks like we have.
Yeah, there is question in the chat there, but also one of the comments from the film that really jumped out at me, it kind of, I don't know if it actually feeds into this or not, but in talking about how the system was designed, and the fact the system was designed to not just marginalize a certain group of people, but to extract resources out of them. So one, I guess, Lauren, if you could talk a little bit about this timeline, but also just an acknowledgement that this is also adding to legal financial obligations and everything that comes with that, and that we saw in the film. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, just that we do those things here, charging people for their own incarceration, charging people for medically unnecessary urinalyses tests at extraordinary cost, run by private labs, and wickedly expensive UA cups that test for 20 panels of drugs you've never heard of. We do that here. So I think we just have so far to go, and around cash bail, which they referenced in the film as well. Dr. Randy, to your question about the 100 million, the question for anyone who can't see it, what is the process and timeline for deciding how to spend the 100 million? So as far as timeline, the money goes live, so to speak, the 1st of July when the state budget, the new budget period begins. And it's actually already categorically parceled out, and I'll try to tell you what I can remember from memory, and I'm sure I'll miss a few things. It's 88.5 million, but so the largest investment is $45 million in standing up this statewide Recovery Navigator program, which is essentially looking at replicating the LEAD model statewide, but accepting referrals, sure, from law enforcement, but also from community for people with untreated substance use disorder in need of services, and really providing that intensive case management and that motivational interviewing and helping people connect to not just to treatment, but also harm reduction services, housing, employment, things of that nature. So that was the largest investment, and that's really an investment in the glue. We've never funded the glue. Like I mentioned, the 3 parts of the substance use disorder continuum of care: pre-treatment, treatment, and recovery support services. We only funded one leg of a 3-legged stool, and then we wondered why the stool wouldn't stand up. So that's the outreach piece. There was also in the outreach category, $12.5 million toward the HOST program, which is the Homeless Outreach Stabilization Transition, something of that nature that works with folks experiencing homelessness and serious mental health challenges. And DESC in King County does that work currently, but looking at a statewide expansion. We also funded in the bill itself, coupled with another amount of funding in the underlying budget, for a total of $10 million, $5 million in the bill, $5 million in the budget, for medications for opioid use disorder in jails, which I know, Dr. Grandy, you'll be happy about that part. And then we also put $4.5 million toward therapeutic interventions and services, including therapeutic courts at the municipal court and district court levels, so that hopefully some of the folks, our resources currently are concentrated in superior courts, the resources that exist, which are insufficient, and individuals who are engaging with our courts of limited jurisdiction, with municipal courts, district courts, are not getting services. And so we essentially make people get a felony or charged with to be able to access more resources, which is absurd. And the hope, again, is to reach people in community before there's any contact with the legal system, but at a minimum, provide some services at those courts of limited jurisdiction. And I don't know that I'm remembering the rest from memory at the moment. There was some investment in recovery housing and some other things, but those will be pushed out as rapidly as possible, particularly the Recovery Navigator program. The Healthcare Authority is working faster than I've ever seen them work. It's really admirable to get that money out the door pretty immediately.
Thank you.
And also I can say that in the meantime, before July 1st happens, there's been work done by the Public Defender Association, by myself, anyway, and the Public Defender Association, to build an informal network that can fill that space of the recovery navigators for law enforcement referrals in the meantime. And we have been able to build out across, we've got something pretty much everywhere across the state. So there, I mean, you know, people can call and at least get some advice, like law enforcement can get advice. And also, you know, and the recovery helpline also stood up, you know, a different way for people to engage with them to get assistance.
Okay, there's a question in the Q&A from Lauren Robbins. Seems like most of our behavioral health interventions treatment are designed to engage people when they enter the legal system. How do you think the Blake decision will impact this approach, such as diversionary court programs? Do either one of you want to answer that?
So ideally, since we're building out LEAD across the, or LEAD-like programs across the state, more so than we already have been, we started doing that with 5380, which was the governor's opioid response, and House Bill 1767, which was funding for jurisdictions through the Washington Association of Sheriff and Police Chiefs. What we have been able to show is that when you do pre-booking diversions, if someone does come in contact with law enforcement, that person is diverted at the point where they would have been arrested. Also, the way that LEAD operates, I provide technical assistance for that expansion across the state, and I'll be also working on this 5476 expansion as well. And we also encourage people to develop community referral mechanisms, all Fidelita's LEAD programs and all LEAD-like programs. We advise them to build their social contact referral portion of their program so that the community can refer people in, and also other service providers can get referred into that pre-booking diversion. So that way we're keeping people as much as possible out of the criminal legal system in order to be able to intervene before they get put into jail and further traumatized.
Did you want to add anything to that, Lauren?
Would you do me a favor, Kelly, and read that question one more time? I apologize.
Yeah.
I couldn't see it in our, it must have gone directly to you. I couldn't find it.
It was in the Q&A.
That requires skills.
Yeah. It seems like most of our behavioral health interventions treatment are designed to engage people when they enter the legal system. How do you think the Blake decision will impact this approach, such as diversionary court programs?
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously Malika did a fantastic job answering. I think the goal is to counter exactly the first sentence of the question. That is true. We help people maybe when they end up at the emergency department a little bit, maybe, maybe, although very unusually, do people get access to services when they contact the legal system. The goal is to have those services just made continuously available and to have the right messengers, which is ideally people with lived experience of substance use disorder, of mental health challenges, of homelessness, incarceration, trauma, who are doing that work and building those relationships. And, that was, I forgot to mention this in regards to the conversations we had in the legislature, but one of the largest misconceptions that I tried to help educate my colleagues around is that people in active addiction don't want help. I mean, we have gobs of data that somewhere between 80 and 95% of people with substance use disorder want help and 11% receive services. And there's this misconception that you've got to force. And there's a very tiny fraction of individuals who may continually refuse treatment, but it is very minor, and we ought not build a system for that extremely small minority of folks who frankly are likely to engage in other crimes that remain a crime. And so if people are really so caught up about needing that hammer, so to speak, you don't need to do that for people who are, again, simply exhibiting a symptom of brain disease because they have drugs on their person.
A few other questions in the chat. I think I want to start with the one here from Jason. I've already heard a lot of war on drugs fear mongering, especially from prosecutors and law enforcement. Is there any work on counter fact-based messaging?
So PDA worked with the Washington Association of Sheriff and Police Chiefs to put out some guidance around the referral process. So that work has been done. However, we don't have, none of the entities that I mentioned have control over what individuals do.
Yeah, I'll just say, great question, Jason. We are working to, actually, as of this came up at a meeting today, Malika and I and others are working to arrange a meeting with WAPA, the prosecutors statewide association, to have a conversation and have a dialogue about the legal interpretation for what the law enforcement's requirements are in terms of that diversion and what that should look like for those two required pre-arrest diversions. And WASPC's been a good partner, the sheriffs and police chiefs to work with. PDA has been working closely with them. But I do think we definitely have some more work to do with WAPA. And even if we're working with the sheriffs and police chiefs, that doesn't mean, an officer, frontline officer in some jurisdiction has received any information necessarily, besides maybe conjecture or rumor. So I definitely think by way of information campaign, we have a lot of work to do.
Great, thank you. Okay, there are a couple other questions in there.
Can I hop in really quick? And
yes.
Also just to Jason, to further address Jason's question, and also for everyone else that's attending today. Part of 5476 is that we need to build the table of advisors across the whole entire state. And so the Healthcare Authority is going to be putting together a group of people that will be able to advise and help develop ongoing policy. And because in 2 years, we sunset back to the Blake decision. That's the other thing that I don't think we mentioned. So in this 2 years, it needs to be an active time that we're all working and organizing to make sure that we can go beyond where we are now and get in that when we sunset to the Blake decision, that we have got a robust and relevant response developed in our state that does not include criminalization. So let me just put that in there as a plug, as a call to action for all of us that are on here today, that we need to get involved in this process so that we can help shape what the policy is going to look like going forward.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Is there anything being done to change policing, especially in marginalized communities? I know that there were several police reform laws, so I don't know if you want to touch on any of those, Rep. Davis.
Sure, I'm happy to, and hats off to my incredible colleagues who really led on these issues. It was our at least in the House Democratic Caucus, our Black Members Caucus and our Members of Color Caucus that really led on the police reform legislation. But just to update you on some of their really significant work. So there was a bill that was passed that was about police tactics, and that does several things. It bans chokeholds and it bans lateral vascular neck restraints. It also bans no-knock warrants. It also restricts conditions under which officers can engage in a vehicle pursuit, as well as conditions under which significantly restricts when they can fire at a moving vehicle. So that was one bill. There was another bill that was passed, House Bill 1310, related to use of force. So Initiative 940 had to do with the standard for use of lethal force, but there was no statewide standard for use of non-lethal force. So specifically under previous law, a law enforcement officer could use any means necessary for an arrest, even for something extremely petty, like we saw in the video. They could use any means necessary and all force necessary to execute an arrest. And so under 940, there's required de-escalation training, but there was not a requirement that officers actually use and employ those de-escalation tactics prior to going hands-on or using force at all. So that's what that bill did, is it set standards that basically says officers have to exhaust all de-escalation tactics before using force and setting that statewide standard. We also passed a bill related to creating an Office of Independent Investigations so that we don't have prosecutors investigating police. They obviously work close together, particularly in the same jurisdiction, and we really wanted to create an independent office. There was also a bill passed that had to do with unlawfully summoning the police. So that has to do with, for instance, the situation in Central Park with the Black gentleman who was bird watching. And if under that new law, that woman would be held criminally liable under this new Washington state law for calling police for that. And then the last one I'll mention is really significant. My colleague, Rep. Jesse Johnson, spearheaded this and several of the other bills I mentioned, but it actually provides access for juveniles to speak with an attorney in real time as soon as that law enforcement contact occurs. So prior to being Mirandized, we see youth that accept Miranda rights and will speak to a law enforcement and maybe say something incriminating or something that will be used against them. And they're young and their brains are not developed. And under this bill, they will actually the law enforcement officer will be required to provide them access to counsel prior to questioning them. So that should be really transformative, particularly as it relates to the juvenile justice system. So those are just some that I'll summarize. There were many more, including a bill related to statewide officer decertification and really strengthening the state's ability to essentially yank a police officer's certification.
And can I respond to something that's in the chat? Okay, so Destin, we can definitely further network in order to help move things forward in Centralia. I'm already on it, and so is Kelly.
Yeah, I'll join those efforts too. And then there was a question a little further up, but it brought up the point that was kind of brought up in the film about the amount of money that is extracted from people in jail and prison, right? And I've been incarcerated. I know how much they charge for deodorant, for just basic hygiene supplies. It's insane. So the question, it's a little bit of a long question, but the end of the question has there been any talks about ending some of these fees or doing something? And I would agree we need to do something with it. I don't remember seeing anything in this last legislative session that specifically addressed in prison fees or in jail fees, but I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wholeheartedly agree. And if I were a legislature one, that would change tomorrow or as soon as 3 years ago when I got elected. I think there would be a lot of interest in that. I'm not aware, as Kelly said, of kind of active legislation, but happy to look into that and figure out what that would look like. Obviously, local authorities currently have a lot of discretion in setting those. And so whether I'm assuming it's something that the state could potentially preempt and set, basically prevent statewide in both the jails and prisons, but happy to look into that more. There's been a lot of work on LFO reform, which is amazing. And if I'm not mistaken, Kelly can correct me, but I think that's largely for people who already are saddled with LFOs, as opposed to more of, I think what the question is, which is the preemptive, like not charging them in the first place, which is also hugely important. And the only one bill that I can think of, I don't think it was run this session, but it was run in the previous session, 2020. It had to do with putting a lid. It did not pass. It was a Rep. Strom Peterson bill about like putting limits on the, who's that freaking company that does the-
JPay?
Yeah, JPay. And then there's another one, the phone calls. I can't think of the name, but putting a limit on what they're allowed to charge for people to contact their loved ones and for people to call home.
So in alignment with that, I'm going to ask a question. It just feels really unjust to me that, local governments and local communities use probation work crews, and that was another piece of the film that really resonated with me when I think about so many people that I know that have been part of probation work crews and work that I did in my past parts of my career trying to help keep them safe because they weren't given PPE when they're out power washing bodily substances, and fluids off of sidewalks, and they're not getting any personal protective equipment, and they're just out there being exploited, and it's just confounding to me. And another thing and in alignment with the COVID, I didn't mention this earlier when Deontay, it made me think of it. Someone I know works at Prison Industries, and they were making PPE, but the people in the prison weren't allowed to have PPE. The incarcerated people were not allowed to have PPE. And that just seemed particularly unethical to me in the midst of a global pandemic.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely unbelievable. And I remember hearing similar reports. I've toured their corrections industries and the different CIA that were then basically tasked with producing PPE in certain instances. But yeah, absolutely. Absolutely unconscionable. I completely agree.
Definitely lots of work to be done. We have a question here from Patrick O'Connor. Essentially, is asking if you wouldn't mind touching on plans to address any ongoing funding gaps in light of the specific to court stakeholders. I know Patrick's with the Thurston County Public Defense, so I was interested in this, but just the intense workload this is put on the courts.
Sure. Yeah, I'll do my best, Patrick. I appreciate the question. I was one of the only non-lawyers on the Blake team. And so it was my colleagues who are attorneys that handled a lot of the funding investments that were related to kind of the retroactive implications of Blake, which include some of the things that you mentioned, mass vacations of records, mass resentencing. And so a couple of the figures that I can remember, they're actually in the bill itself. Some of them, and some of them are in the underlying budget, but I believe there was $11 million to the Office of Public Defense to help with the mass resentencings. There was also a substantial amount of money in the millions for the Office of Civil Legal Aid related to helping people with vacation of their past possession charges in mass. Those were, and then there was, you didn't ask about this specifically, but there was money given to local governments for refunding of legal financial obligations that were paid by people who previously had paid. I think it was an average of $970 for a felony possession charge. So those were some of the investments related to the legal system, specifically in the bill.
And I can say specifically in Thurston County, I know that the prosecuting attorney's office got $56 million. So I don't know if that's going to be used towards refunding people's money, or if it could be, we had proposed a framework of maybe a summer of freedom sort of framework where we did mass vacations, you get volunteer, legal students to help just do it en masse. And of course, the people that are entitled to more specific relief, then, they can get that. But this doesn't have to be like an ongoing, super complicated process. There are mechanisms and ways to be able to design to do this efficiently and effectively and quickly and not super expensive. But maybe talk to Thunheim about that 56 million.
There's another question here. I actually think I might be able to answer this one. It says, is there any part of the criminal legal system that wasn't rooted in slavery? I think no.
Unfortunately not. I don't think people in America are ready to reckon with how much of the structures of our government in this country are rooted in genocide and the stealing of and stolen land and stolen people and the enslavement of those people.
And the wealth that has been built on the back. Right.
So then that brings into the picture reparations, if we want to talk about that.
Well, we have 5 minutes. Do you want to, each of you maybe give a closing couple thoughts? I appreciate everybody for being here. I don't know that link was working for the book, so I'm sorry if I misunderstood what that was about, but it came from the people who did the film. So Malika, do you want to go first?
Lauren can go first.
Okay.
Well, thanks again, everybody, for being here, and thank you for having us. I guess what I'll say is something that Thea's question made me think of. So I used to, for a number of years when I was younger, I lived in West Africa, in Ghana specifically, and west of where I lived, which was in the capital, the entire Ghanaian coast is dotted with slave castles, several of which are still standing. And I've been to them, and perhaps the most harrowing experience of my life. And fast forward to, a decade later, I'm in the state legislature, and we were touring a prison, and they were showing us their newfangled body scanner because they were, previously using metals, whatever they were using, and couldn't see drugs maybe that were in a person's cavity of their body. And so the legislature had actually funded these body scanners, and they were generally organizations are like, hey, look, this is what your money bought. So they're showing us this body scanner And this was at Purdy, the women's prison, and they were showing us an example of where they had found drugs. A woman had drugs in her vagina, and they were trying to show us this particular image to show us that they were able to see these balloons. And all I could see, because of the way it was a black image with, like, you know, white, you could see the balloons somewhat, but what showed up completely bright white at the bottom of this image that I will never forget was her shackles. And they were bright white on a black screen. And I just flashed to these shackles that they still have on the walls of these slave castles in Ghana. And they were practically identical. And that image, I will never forget this group of, you know, legislators and officials looking at this thing, and I could not take my eyes off of what was bright white and what exactly that looked like, and how little has changed. And I just appreciate this conversation and appreciate all of you, and hope to continue to work in partnership with all of you, because we just have so much to do.
And I think that, you know, we have to continue to work to dismantle our prohibition-based system that criminalizes people at every turn, especially Black and Brown people. And it was designed to do so. Our systems are not broken. They're operating as intended. And it is our responsibility to dismantle those systems and replace them with more equitable and just systems that will help people prosper, and not just return them to baseline oppression, but to a place where they can actually have a prosperous and good life, and we can help repair the harms that we have caused people on purpose in our society. It is time to dismantle these systems. So I hope all of you will get involved in, we've got work to do. It's time to roll up our sleeves. We got 2 years, because I guarantee you, those that want to go back to the old way of, or the status quo, they're organizing as well. Thank you for attending.
Absolutely. So yeah, just to close it out, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I appreciate everybody who has attended, and let's keep these conversations and the work going. Please reach out to us if you've got questions, and thank you everybody for being here.
Thanks everybody, good night.